Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a close look at some really complex information about the roles and, the expectations between the United States and its European allies.
Yeah, it really zeroes in on defense priorities, doesn't it? And how different sides see global engagement, especially with, everything changing globally.
Exactly. So our mission here is to sort of unpack the core arguments, the observations, maybe even the tensions you can see in this. We want to help you quickly grasp the different viewpoints.
Viewpoints on European defense, NATO's focus may be shifting, and these, differing approaches to big challenges, China, obviously, and a situation with Russia.
It's about understanding who feels responsible for what and where maybe resources and attention should really go, according to these different perspectives anyway.
Let's dive in.
Okay, let's unpack this. We start with this suggestion, right, that the administration of U.S. President Trump might be continuing a kind of policy push from before.
Asking NATO for help concerning China, is that the idea?
That seems to be the suggestion. But almost immediately, there's a counterargument presented.
Which says?
That expecting, significant European military aid way out in the Pacific, it might just be unrealistic. Fundamentally unrealistic.
Right. Questioning if that's even feasible. And building on that, there's this other angle.
Go on.
That maybe Europe's best contribution, the most valuable thing they could do for Washington, isn't sending ships far away, but taking full responsibility for their own defense, securing their own neighborhood first.
Okay, so sorting things out closer to home. But this raises a question, doesn't it? What does the U.S. actually want from Europe regarding the Indo-Pacific?
And the information suggests the answer isn't totally clear. There seems to be some ambiguity, even from U.S. officials.
Yeah, like that example of one U.S. official traveling in Asia suggesting Europe should play a bigger military role there.
But the reasoning was
that China, quote, does not take into account the presence of other countries. So the implication was it'd be useful if China had to consider a European presence.
Okay, complicate China's thinking. But didn't that same official kind of walk it back a bit?
Well, yeah. At the same time, they apparently stated a preference for Europe's main defense investments to stay on the continent.
So, be bigger in Asia, but mostly spend your money at home. That sounds
mixed, yeah. Bit contradictory, maybe.
And that's contrasted with another U.S. official who is apparently more direct.
Much more direct. Basically saying Europeans should primarily focus on their own region. Full stop.
Which aligns more with that idea of European self-sufficiency being the priority.
Right. But here's where it gets really interesting. Kind of points to this potential disconnect.
Okay.
There's this observation that even while some European governments might be, let's say, reluctant to fully fund their own defense, some of those same governments seem drawn to what's called a role power temptation.
Seeking global influence, projecting power on the world stage.
Exactly. Even if, from this perspective, the basic job of defending their own patch isn't fully sorted or funded.
And there are examples given.
Oh, yeah. French President Emmanuel Macron is presented as a prime example, visiting Asia, declaring France an Indo-Pacific player.
Right, I remember hearing about that. He called for joint Europe-Asia action too, didn't he? An independent coalition?
That's it, to maintain an open environment and a rules-based order, positioning France as a reliable partner, which, sounds like it implies a military role.
And didn't he make some waves with a comment directed at China?
A pretty audacious one, yeah. Suggesting basically if China doesn't want NATO involved in Southeast Asia, then China should stop North Korea from interfering in European affairs.
Wow. Linking security across continents like that, a quid pro quo.
Though it's pointed out how exactly Beijing was supposed to stop North Korea cooperating with Russia. That wasn't really explained.
Still, it shows that global strategic thinking. But okay, France and maybe the UK have some capacity for long-range naval stuff.
Historically, yeah, some experience.
But what about most other European states?
The description used is that they can mostly only mimic activity outside their own continent.
Mimic. Quite a word. Suggests more show than substance.
It implies that, yeah, like Germany, they have an official Indo-Pacific strategy. They sent a frigate out there 4 years back, the Bavaria.
Intended to deter China, presumably.
That was reportedly part of the goal. But the reception...
Let me guess. Not great.
Apparently, China just dismissed the effort, Declined Germany's request for a port visit in Shanghai. A cold shoulder.
Ouch. Suggests Beijing didn't see it as a major strategic factor. And what about the overall numbers? European naval power.
The figures again paint a picture. France, maybe 22 major surface ships, 9 subs. UK, 16 surface, 10 subs. Italy, 18 surface, 8 subs.
Okay.
Turkey, 17 surface, 13 subs. Greece, 13 surface, 10 subs. Germany, 11 surface, 6 subs. And Spain, 11 surface, only 2 subs.
So not insignificant fleets for some, but context is key, right?
Absolutely. Like, it's noted the Turkish and Greek fleets are largely focused on each other, and the quality, the tech level, varies a lot. These aren't all high-end blue water navies ready for independent ops far from home.
Right. So limited capacity for sustained power projection for most.
Yet the political ambition seems to persist. Just 2 years ago, the EU High Representative at the time called for European navies to patrol the Taiwan Strait.
Really? To show focus on freedom of navigation there.
Because that was the stated reason, which really highlights this tension, doesn't it?
Definitely. How do these ambitions, being an Indo-Pacific player, patrolling the Taiwan Strait, stack up against the actual military realities, the naval numbers we just talked about?
It suggests a potential gap, a big one maybe, between the desire to be a global player and the actual means to do it effectively, especially far from home.
So given that assessment, that limited capacity for, say, Pacific operations, where should Europe's focus be, according to the argument here, especially thinking about U.S. interests?
The main argument is pretty clear. Yes, European help against China would be nice for the U.S., ideal even, but something else is seen as much more important, more achievable too.
Which is?
Building a strong European coalition, one with enough conventional clout and nuclear where relevant.
To do what?
To deter, and if it comes to it, defeat Russia and any other unfriendly states in or near Europe. That's presented as the #1 job, the most realistic, most beneficial thing for Europe to focus on from this U.S.-centric perspective.
Okay, focus on the immediate neighborhood first, and that leads to implications for the U.S. presence in Europe.
Big implications. The argument follows that the U.S. shouldn't insist on keeping tens of thousands of troops and huge resources parked in Europe forever with open-ended security guarantees.
Because if Europe takes primary responsibility for its own regional defense,
the need for that large, permanent U.S. presence, specifically for that purpose, starts to fade.
The thinking being, if Europe genuinely handles its own defense against nearby threats, like Russia,
then they're in a stronger position overall. They could also potentially gear up for other kinds of cooperation, maybe economic measures with the U.S. against China, for example.
Right, a better division of labor, perhaps. Instead of the U.S. trying to police the Asia-Pacific and be Europe's main backstop against Russia simultaneously.
Exactly. It questions why the U.S. should carry both those heavy burdens almost single-handedly.
Which brings us to another point raised Washington's style, the tendency to, well, tell allies what to do.
Yeah, that's highlighted as a major friction point, often disliked, even by friendly governments.
And there was that quote from Macron.
Yes, at the Shangri-La dialogue. He said basically, we want to cooperate but not be dependent. We want to unite but not be told daily what we can or cannot do. It's pretty blunt.
Very clear discomfort with being dictated to.
So the argument presented is, instead of dictating, the U.S. should lay out its own plans, its intentions, and then work with Europe on joint measures. True cooperation, not top-down direction.
Makes sense. And there's historical context offered for why Europe maybe hasn't spent as much on defense as the U.S. might have liked.
Yeah, it suggests that decades of relatively lower European military spending weren't just neglect. They were conscious choices.
Calculated savings, different threat perceptions.
Both. Even during the Cold War, it's argued, most European NATO members feared a Soviet invasion less than Washington did. Their priorities often lean more towards welfare states, economic growth.
Over massive military budgets. I remember reading about the pipeline controversy back then, too.
Right. Building gas pipelines to the Soviets while the U.S. was focused on the military threat. It suggests the perceived danger from Moscow just didn't always align across the Atlantic.
And does that view argue this perception continues even now after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine?
It suggests that for many Europeans, there's still not seen to be a huge direct military threat from Moscow to NATO territory.
The argument being Russia hasn't shown the desire or, maybe more importantly, the ability to march across Europe.
Pretty much. Its focus and its struggles have been in Ukraine, which isn't NATO. The question posed is, if Russia's having a hard time there, while also facing attacks on its own soil, how could it possibly conquer the rest of NATO Europe?
And examples like Spain and Italy's lower spending are used to illustrate this perceived lower threat assessment in some parts of Europe.
Yes, highlighting the continued reliance, perhaps, on the U.S. security umbrella.
Okay, so given all the ambition-reality gap, the history, the threat assessment, what's the proposed U.S. path forward here?
The perspective strongly suggests a reset. Make European self-defense the actual goal, and to show they're serious.
Concrete steps.
Like a phased withdrawal of U.S. forces from Europe over time.
A phased withdrawal. Wow. And then what?
Then, European governments would have to make their own assessment of the threats they face, and they'd be responsible for figuring out and funding their own responses, based on their risk calculation.
But cooperation wouldn't totally end.
No. The idea isn't isolation. Future U.S. administrations could still cooperate with Europe, but it would happen while that phased withdrawal continues. And crucially,
Who's that?
Europeans could spend what they want on defense. No more U.S. pressure about hitting 2% of GDP or whatever. But the U.S. shouldn't back down from the withdrawal plan, even with the expected complaints or anxiety from allies.
Okay. And could the U.S. still ask for help on global stuff, like China? Yes, absolutely. But it would be approached differently, as a matter of mutual interest between independent players, cooperation between equals, not a dependency thing.
And the current way of doing things
is seen as a losing strategy for the U.S., trying to buy help by treating allies like dependents who need constant U.S. protection.
There were examples of that perceived bad bargain, right?
Yeah, like some NATO allies offering maybe limited support in places like Afghanistan or Iraq, in exchange for the U.S. basically promising to risk nuclear war with Russia for them under Article 5, seen as a bad trade for the U.S.
It would have been better, the argument implies, if Europe could deter Russia itself.
Exactly. And similarly, keeping U.S. troops in Europe to protect it, while maybe hoping Germany sends, a whole 2 frigates to the Pacific next time, that's also framed as a poor deal for America.
So, pulling it all together, the conclusion seems to be, yes, it would be good if Europe played a bigger role globally.
But, and it's a huge but, only if and after European countries get serious about securing their own defense first. In their own neighborhood. That's priority number 1.
And getting Europe to actually do that requires the U.S. to change its approach.
Fundamentally, stop telling allies what to do on spending. Instead, clearly state U.S. intentions, like the withdrawal plan, and basically shift the responsibility for Europe's defense onto Europeans themselves.
It's a call for a pretty major shift in the transatlantic relationship, moving away from dependency.
Towards European self-reliance in defense, which, maybe paradoxically, could then allow for more genuine, effective cooperation on global issues down the line.
It definitely challenges the status quo, doesn't it? Leaves you wondering if the current setup is sustainable, or if a shift like this could actually lead to a stronger Europe and a more balanced partnership.
Big questions about incentives, responsibility, and what real security cooperation looks like going forward.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We're here to make things clear. New episodes every day.